Well, much to all of your disappointment, I'm back. And Tina can no longer run the show however she wants. Or maybe she just will, and it won't matter that I'm actually here. Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for watching. I want to thank my beautiful bride, Queen of the Bees, for following and hosting while I had to be away on a trip. But we're back now, and we decided, what are we going to talk about? And I said, we have talked so much about Thomas Sowell on this episode. We've talked about quotes. We've talked about his academic work. We've talked about the books that he's written. We need to have a show dedicated to Thomas Sowell, explaining to everyone why they should absolutely love and admire him. And we decided that one of the best ways to do this was just kind of give like a quick overview of his earlier life, growing up in New York City, getting into academia, and then we're going to go straight into a compilation of some of the best clips from Thomas Sowell going back 40, 50 years. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a bunch of reacts to Thomas Sowell quotes, and by the end of it, if you're not all running out and getting Thomas Sowell tattoos, well, then there's just something wrong with you. All of that and more coming up on this episode, powered by Good Ranchers.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate everyone who's joined our community chat, and we would love for you to join us there too. So if you haven't already, go down to the link in the description of this episode. Be sure to join there, and you'll also find that link to purchase your first box of Good Ranchers there as well.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, still a good person, and I'm back. I was not overthrown in a violent coup by Queen of the Bees, but I think she was thinking about it. With us, as always, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Yes, there's so much less pressure from this seat. In that seat, you have to be funny and interesting, and I mean, I can only do that for so long.
You do it all the time, baby. But I was a little worried though when you put someone called Queen of the Bees in charge, and you look at the hierarchy within a beehive and what a queen bee does to her rivals. Like, oh gosh.
I didn't ask for that name.
Hey,
you bestowed it.
Well,
speaking of names, sitting right next to me is the Christian of Doom.
Oh, is that what's been decided?
Resident Black Pillar.
Resident Black Pillar.
Stop calling me a black pillar. I'm trying to be optimistic.
Oh,
it's
really?
like everybody's encouraging me to be pessimistic.
It's almost like we're encouraging you to embrace the dark. Yes, good.
I will say this. Tina says that she wasn't interesting, but I have the ability to look deep into the numbers of each episode, and I just want to point out that Tuesday's episode is on track to be like our highest performing episode ever on the audio side.
So I will soon be usurped.
I think we need to kick Nick out of the studio more often.
Yeah, there's already a question in the chat asking, why is Tina still your bride if you're married? Like,
man, just stop thinking about it too much. All right, and then of course we have our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
Nick, you made me a Thomas Sowell fan probably 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
And I have appreciated this guy so much, just the simplicity in what he says, but how logical it is. So I'm excited for this.
Well, I always tell people, like, if you were forced to read one author when it comes to everything from philosophy, economics, politics, sociology, history, read the Bible because it was inspired by God. But if you could read two authors, right, the only would be Thomas Sowell. Like the amount of books that he has written is incredible. And again, I think he's fun to read. Most people don't look at a book called Basic Economics and think, well, this is going to be a rip-roaring good time. But when you're reading it with Thomas Sowell, you really feel like you're coming away understanding complex principles. And one of the things that I found so just refreshing about it is he's fun to read. He's kind of a smart aleck. He's really fun to watch in interviews, especially the ones on Uncommon Knowledge. We'll talk a little bit about that as
You're saying he's fun to read.
Show some
You
clips.
gave this book, Basic Economics, to our kids in junior high as required reading because we homeschool.
Yeah, and our kids are doing excellent.
Yeah, they are. That's true.
But no, he really. It's amazing because so many people in academia, it's almost like there's this drive to make things sound more complex than they really need to be. And Thomas Sowell does the exact opposite. Not because the world is always like perfectly simple. Obviously, there's multiple perspectives, there's multiple factors that go into things. But he takes those into account, but then he like demystifies them. And so now all of a sudden, as more of a layman, it's not as if you can argue on the same level as Thomas Sowell or you've read all this, but it's as if you have a trusted reference point to go back to when you hear some of these claims about economics, especially coming from politicians like Elizabeth Warren or AOC. Thomas Sowell ends up being the guy that you can go back to and be like, okay, I want to test this against somebody that spent their entire life dedicated to researching this from multiple perspectives and get some good feedback. And so that's what he loves. And Torino de Guzman, thank you very much on our super chat, because the day Thomas Sowell dies, the day our nation suffers a massive drop in the average IQ. Also, why isn't he in Ebony magazine yet? I'll tell you what, we did a Why Minute once on why the left hates Thomas Sowell. And you're going to see it in some of the clips that we talk about. It's a good question. We're going to see it in some of the clips that we're going to talk about here, because Thomas Sowell should be someone that I would say everyone could look up to. If you look at his early life, I believe both of his parents passed away when he was relatively young. That was in North Carolina. He lived in rural North Carolina. I don't think he even had indoor plumbing in the house that he was born into. And this was at a time in North Carolina where, again, you still had Jim Crow laws. Like you had proactive segregation. You had discriminatory laws on the books. I mean, it was not an easy place to be living if you were a Black American. And when his parents died, he went up to New York City to live with, I believe grandparents or it might have been an aunt or uncle. Don't quote me on that. There's a good video that kind of goes through that period of his life. But understand, like, he dropped out of high school, right? This is a guy that's gone to Harvard. He's gone to Chicago. He's taught at UCLA. He's taught at Stanford. He dropped out of high school. And when he was living up in New York, he had a couple different jobs. One of the jobs he talked about was driving a messenger bike. So, he rode his bike and like delivered, mail and telegrams and things of that nature. And he talks about his experience there, like when he was feeling, especially flush with cash, like he would take the Fifth Avenue bus instead of, the one of the other buses or walking or whatnot. And he was talking about during that time when he was young, just trying to kind of make sense of the world. And one of the things he said that really set him on a good path was he spent a lot of time at the library because he was poor. It's not like he had a lot of money. He spent a lot of time at the library and whatnot. But
it was a friend that took him to the library.
It was an older, I think it was either an older friend or kind of like a family member that kind of regularly took him there and kind of opened up to his world to the various things that he have access to, the knowledge he could have access to. But in the process of that, he read Karl Marx. He bought an old Encyclopedia Britannica, and he read about Karl Marx. And Thomas Sowell, when he was younger, was actually a Marxist. And for him, he describes this, for him, riding the bus through New York City, where you would ride through, Manhattan and the skyscrapers and all like the lavish apartments and everything else. And then you'd get into the tenements, you get into the other housing, the poverty. And for him, he felt like, well, Marx was the only one that was actually bothering to explain why this would work the way it was. And what's fascinating is from that point of losing his parents, dropping out of high school, working in New York City, he actually got into Harvard. Right? That's not the normal process that we think about, especially for that time. And especially for a time where he's a Black man growing up in a very, very different America than we have right now. But he gets into Harvard, and he's studying economics, among other things. And then this is the part that blew my mind about his early story. He transfers over and he's in Chicago. Right, University of Chicago was famous. They call it the Chicago School of Economics, and the person that led that was Milton Friedman,
who was not a Marxist.
Oh my gosh! Like Milton Friedman is kind of like a renowned libertarian, free market economist. I would say, I mean, Christian, tell me what you think on this, but I would say that arguably the two most what you would call free market oriented schools are Chicago and the Austrian School.
Yeah, but I mean, I remember months ago. Maybe it was like almost a year ago, you and I had a debate about this, and I was a little bit more supportive of the Chicago school. But
I'm more Austrian school.
I was about to say I think I've changed my mind on that because my entire argument was centered around how I think the Dogecoin would be better than Bitcoin as a replacement to the dollar. I actually still believe that, but no, I don't think anything can really trump the Austrian business cycle in terms of just the sheer power behind it. So I don't know. I'm probably much more Mises than Milton anymore.
Can you guys
at this point?
please,
let me give
for somebody that doesn't actually live and breathe economics and doesn't completely understand all the terms that you're throwing out, can you now? There's Keynesian economics,
Yeah.
Austrian economics. You've got Chicago School. Can you give as quickly as possible and concisely as possible the key differences between the three?
Well, I'm out.
Well, let's do this.
Just
because
bullet points.
There's a lot of similarities between Austrian and Chicago School. The biggest difference between the Chicago School and the Austrian School in some respects probably had to do with things like monetary policy. Milton Friedman's explanation for why the Great Depression took place and some of the things that were the catalyst and kicked it off largely streamed around problems with the Federal Reserve, but the solutions he offered were different than the Austrian school would say, go back to sound money and get rid of central banks. Milton Friedman would say, well, no, central banks can serve a purpose, but they should work off of like a calculation model instead of kind of like the arbitrary whims of the, chairman of the Federal Reserve and politicians. And, but when it comes to like a basic understanding of free market principles and the idea of like marginal utility, which is to say that things don't have value because of all the labor that went into making it. Things have value because people demand it within the marketplace. And this is a major departure from things like Marxism, because Marxism and the labor theory of value was to say that the value of this laptop is the sum total of all the things that went into making it combined with the sum total of the labor that went into making it. And, Milton Friedman was famous for going over to, China and Hong Kong and India and actually advising on economics. And here's a perfect kind of representation of this. Milton Friedman, when he went over to China, was observing this massive dig project, this massive infrastructure project that the Chinese government was engaging in. And he asked the question, he's like, you've got hundreds, if not thousands of people out here, with shovels digging these ditches and these trenches. Why don't you bring in heavy equipment to do this? It'll be much more efficient. And the representative from the Chinese government was like, well, Dr. Friedman, you don't understand. This is a works project. And he goes, and basically what he meant by that is, well, this is just a project to employ people. And he goes, oh, in that case, take away the shovels, right? Make them do it by hand. You'll have to employ 3 times as many people. And the principle that he was illustrating there was, work can be hard, work can be labor intensive. That doesn't mean it's the most valuable or effective or efficient way to do it. And ultimately what economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, all right? So what you want is an economy that is effective and efficient at producing the goods and services that people want. So that's the free market approach is private property rights. You can own a business, you can develop things, but you have to compete in the marketplace where people can choose to do business with someone else. People can choose to set up a business that competes with you. Free markets tend to, really oppose government intervention into the economy, whether it's controlling it or subsidizing it or regulating it. They want as free a market as possible. Whereas the Marxist view, right, and this is what Thomas Sowell is. So on one side, I just described Milton Friedman. On the other side, at that point in his life, Thomas Sowell believed that there should be no such thing as the private ownership and the means of production. What that means is no private entity can own a company. No private entity can own large capital. Presumably you couldn't own a tractor. You couldn't own a sawmill. You couldn't own, all of the major tools that you would use in order to build things. That would have to be owned by, quote, the people.
Right.
And the way that always manifested was it was owned by the state. I want to give a shout out real quick to Holy LDGP. He goes, Sowell's writing makes complex subjects accessible. That's a great way to put it. I say simplify, but accessible, I think, is a much better way to put it. So, thank you for that. So
people are reminding you that I said bullet points, but and somebody has a wonderful Princess Bride quote. Let me explain. No, there's no time. Let me sum up. I'm pretty sure that's a Princess Bride quote.
Yeah, no, it is. Let me sum up. So here's what it comes down to. Thomas Sowell was going into Milton Friedman, one of the foremost champions for free markets. He actually set up a whole series called Free to Choose, which interestingly enough, later on, Thomas Sowell would actually star in as an ally of Milton Friedman. But Thomas Sowell likes to say that it wasn't Milton Friedman that turned him away from Marxism. And I don't want to get too much into that because I think we have a clip where Thomas Sowell is asked this question. He's like, you were a Marxist under Milton Friedman, and Friedman didn't convince you to be a free market advocate. What did? And he explains in one of these clips, and I'm going to save that. But I think the important thing to remember here is this. One of the things that when we talk about with economics, and one of the things that Thomas Sowell emphasizes is when we're talking about economics, we generally have this concept of value, right? Now, values can be something that they can be like philosophical principles that you care about, that you know, honor and integrity and love and honesty. These can all be values. And then value within the marketplace is based off of this concept of, you know, what do I want? And we've all purchased things that we said were like cheap, and we didn't mean it good, right? It might not have cost much money, but we didn't think we got any value of what we bought, even though it was cheap. There's other things that we paid way too much money for, and we thought to ourselves, well, that was like overly expensive, because once again, the value proposition wasn't there for the price. And so they talk about this whole idea of how do you do the best job of getting like that equilibrium where the price and the value for what you get is quality, and you don't mind the price because what you got was exactly what you were promised, right? The value proposition came through. And nothing does a better job of doing that than Good Ranchers.
Oh.
Because now hear me out, right? Because you don't want to, you could go to the store right now and you could buy crappy meat that was raised somewhere else that was full of you don't know what in the raising process, right? And it might be cheaper, but you're not getting value. You could go somewhere, you could go out to a fancy steak place and you could get maybe it was a good piece of steak, but you're thinking to yourself, this was not worth what I paid for it. And then you find Good Ranchers, right? And now it comes to your door. And do they share your values? Yes, they do. They do share your values. They want to make sure that they are raised from American farms, whether it's the beef, whether it's the poultry, you know, all that stuff comes directly to your door. The value is there, right? You are getting exactly what you paid for. You're satisfied for it. It's an excellent representation of what happens when the free market is allowed to marshal those resources and companies that do a good job getting people the very thing that they need. And now with our promo code, there's actually a different deal now. I think it's a better deal.
It is.
You're going to get $25 off. You're going to get free shipping. Plus you sign up for one of the subscriptions and you're going to get 2 pounds of very, very quality ground beef. And I'll tell you this much, again, you can go get a cheap hamburger somewhere, or you can go get this and you can make something truly, truly quality. So you go promo code Nick in the description. What are you going to get? You're going to get great value from a company that shares your values. Plus, you're going to get some free stuff too when you sign up for one of the subscriptions. So go check that out and tune in next Tuesday for another excellent segue into why you should buy Good Ranchers.
Nick, you left out the most important part, which is you're supporting the podcast if you go to them.
That is also true. That is also true. I feel like that. I love.
It is literally true.
I know. I love promoting people that are doing good things.
For the audience that's listening, especially our longtime listeners, Nick will never say anything good about himself or our show. So it's on us, the other 3 people here at the table, to point out that, like,
I'll say good things about you guys on the show.
Yes, but he'll never say anything good about himself. So I really just want to emphasize this, that, you know, yes, it's great value. I genuinely like their stuff.
Yeah.
I cooked some buffalo chicken mac with it a few months ago. It was really good. But
you make a mean buffalo chicken mac.
I do.
Too.
I need to make some more again.
Yeah.
But like, no, seriously, we've had so many people, like in Circle and other places, be like, how can I support the podcast? That is genuinely one of the best ways that you can support the podcast.
And if you use the promo code, and the whole reason why we have those promo codes is partially to give you a good deal, but it's also to signify to Good Ranchers that, you know, hey, look, people are using, you know, what they learned here in order to buy the product. So again, we really like Ben Spell, love the company and their values, and really also like the product that they produce.
But you know who we also like is Thomas Sowell.
We love Thomas Sowell. Like it's like I fanboy about Thomas Sowell. It gets yeah.
So that was not short at all. Synopsis of that. That was the Christian answer to explaining the different approaches.
Why say it in 2 words when you can use 20?
That's or we could use 200.
I'm in politics, sweetheart. This is just how this works.
I work in academia, so you're actually rewarded for using more complicated words than you need to. Yeah. But would you say that Thomas Sowell is more in the Austrian camp than the Chicago camp, or would you say he's more in the Chicago camp? He
was asked about this once, and he associated himself with the Chicago school. Which makes sense. Like him and Milton Friedman spent so much, time working together. Free to Choose was a great series, a really good series. It was one of the first things when I was kind of, trying to develop my worldview on economics and things like that, I remember picking up Capitalism and Freedom at a yard sale. Like I remember picking up that book and reading through it and then thinking, wow, I like what this guy has to say. And then watching Free to Choose, which again, I thought Milton Friedman was another one of those people that did a brilliant job of explaining complex principles in a way that was easy to grasp and understand and accessible, as Holly put it earlier. That's a great way to describe it. And Thomas Sowell was one of the rock stars of that series. And as Milton Friedman was getting a little bit older and whatnot, Thomas Sowell, I think, really filled into that role of carrying on that message. And nothing against Milton Friedman at all, but I do think Thomas Sowell just took it to another level. And he's just such a prolific author. So here's what we're going to do now. Rather than me sitting here and gushing over Tom, right, we're going to go ahead and go through some of we got like a bunch of clips here. I don't know if we'll be able to get to
highlights,
all of them.
Some Thomas Sowell highlights.
And what we did here is we actually have so much of what he's talking about here is questions that he's gotten over several books that he's written. And somebody asked a question earlier on what book I would recommend from Thomas Sowell. We're going to get to that. But first, I want you guys to kind of see the clips and understand what I'm talking about with that dynamic. So let's go ahead and jump in here to our first clip.
Nick, I need 20 seconds.
Okay, never mind. We can't jump into our first clip. Our producer of producers is running behind. I'm so disappointed right now.
You should be.
My gosh.
You should be.
Thomas Sowell would have never let us down like this.
Well, while we're waiting, somebody asked if there's a promo code for Thomas Sowell books, but no, definitely not.
Oh,
Thomas Sowell does not need our help.
I did a commending resolution for Thomas Sowell. My mom actually called. I found out about this later because I was gushing about Thomas Sowell. She goes, I talked to him once, and I was like most like you talked to Tom Brady. Like I'm like I don't care. Like you talked to Thomas Sowell. She goes, yeah, I called him up to invite him to speak at something. And he goes, how did you get this number? Because he has the whole process because thousands of people are asking him to come and talk and everything else. And so my mom wasn't supposed to have that number, but she got to have a brief conversation. I did a commending resolution for him for his life's work. I did one for Walter Williams and I did one for Thomas Sowell because I admire them both a great deal. And we sent it off. We sent it off to him, and I still haven't gotten confirmation if he's received it. So, imagine going to all this trouble to run for the legislature so you can one day write your hero a huge thank you card on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and you don't know if he got it yet because you said it during COVID. All right, let's go ahead and go through our first clip here.
Talking about health care, they said 30 million people couldn't afford it or something?
Several million of those were making more than $50,000 a year. So it's not, see, this is one of the things the Anointed do. They never believe that people make choices. There are people who have the money, they prefer to put that money into a BMW rather than
a lot of young people didn't want health care. They were betting on their health.
Absolutely. And then this allows them to buy more stuff they want to buy. So it's not a question that they couldn't afford it. It's a question they don't choose to spend the money. People say, you're a very tough person. I'm not tough. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you with those facts. I am not one who believes that the kids should be given unlimited indulgence, and I think I can safely say that mine were not.
All right.
I love that. I'm not tough. Life is tough.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to get you acquainted with the facts. It's lines like that make me just love what this guy has to say.
Well, and so he's...
I have to pause you guys for just a second because your video was still on the screen and you're over here trying to sneeze without making noise, but you're on video trying to sneeze into your shirt and everybody's probably wondering what in the world you're doing.
Thanks, Hamilton.
He was just sneezing. And Hamilton felt like you guys could go ahead and see that.
Okay.
We're gonna blame Hamilton for that. No, so back to the Thomas Sowell. There's two things I really like about this. One is obviously the quote you just mentioned. Life is tough. I'm just trying to acquaint people with those facts so they can better understand and navigate, essentially. But he also talked about this whole idea of healthcare. Now, this is coming from his book, Vision of the Anointed. That was the reference that the guy made about, this is what the anointed always do. And this was back before a lot of the healthcare laws that got put into place under Obamacare and everything like that finally, came to fruition. And one of the things he was talking about here is the idea that healthcare, you hear this a lot, healthcare is a right. Can I just say something right now? Healthcare can't be a right. It can't be a right in the sense that, you have freedom of speech or you have the right to keep and bear arms. Like it can't be a right in the same way. And the reason why is because healthcare is a series of goods and services. And so if you make it a right, like you have an inherent right to healthcare, then what you're saying is somebody else has a legal or moral obligation to, or no, not even moral, a legal obligation to provide it to you. Otherwise, you're being denied your rights. And Thomas Sowell was very big on saying that, look, that may sound good when politicians say it, but if you actually treat it that way, then you actually don't understand the nature of the problem. And the nature of the problem is this is about commodities and services. And the easier you make it for people to be able to deliver or provide those commodities, the more the cost goes down. And the more you add tons of bureaucracy on it. He had this one quote I loved where he said, it was that thing where you think healthcare is expensive now, just wait until it's free. And he was saying, he goes, I don't understand how in a system, we're saying that healthcare is currently too expensive. But what we're going to do is we're going to add a massive federal bureaucracy, massive amounts of federal regulation. That's somehow going to make it more accessible, cheaper, and easier. And then people bring up things like the National Health Service in England or Canada, and only people now are starting to realize that that was not what it was promised. It might be very convenient for you if you have minor things that need to be done, but when people are actually in significant health crisis, a lot of times they end up coming to the United States or other places with more of a free market health system. Not to mention that he does a great job of explaining that everything you don't like about the American health system is not because the government's not involved, it's because the government is involved. And so once again, it's this false dichotomy where people constantly interject more government bureaucracy into the health system, more government regulation, more subsidies, more everything else. And then when it doesn't work, the only conclusion they come to is, well, it's because we don't have enough control. Let's go and look at the next clip.
Getting there.
Do people think you sold out because you're conservative?
Is this the same clip?
No.
No, okay.
The people who are supposed to have sold out typically have less money than the ones who are making the accusation. Some student wrote to me and I said, what you need to do is make a list of all the blacks who think you have stood up for the right thing. Alongside each name, put down the name and model of car that they drive. And then see if you want to reconsider what you've just said.
Liberal says conservatives only care about rich people. When they were talking about health care, they said 30 million people couldn't afford it or
Okay,
something?
Several
pause
million
right there,
of those
'cause
were making more than $50,000.
So the part that he talked about here that I thought was a really interesting take is this idea that black conservatives have sold out. And you see this a lot. I mean, they go so far as to call people like Thomas Sowell and Clarence Thomas and Winsome Sears, Uncle Toms or whatnot. Like I've heard people say this, and I don't mean just on the news. Like I know people that have said it to me directly, and it's a horribly offensive thing to say about them. But the point that this is one of the things that Thomas Sowell does so well, is that he will challenge the questioner or the person making the accusation with their own presuppositions with respect to the words that they use. He goes, okay, you're claiming that black conservatives sold out. He's all right, well, presumably someone that sells out is giving up on their values or principles in order to get some sort of economic, political, or social gain as a result. He said, okay, great. Why don't you line all of us up that are out there in the world talking about these various things, making these statements, and then take down, again, the make and model of the car they're driving. And what you're going to find is that it's people on the left that have done far better financially by reinforcing that narrative than it is the black conservatives that have stood up and said, look, this is wrong and we don't agree with it. And I think it's an excellent point that he made. And again, there's a number of ways he could have said that. He could have tried to just come right out and defend himself. He could have pointed to specific illustrations that wasn't true. But no, what did he do? He questioned the person making the accusation or the statement within their own presuppositions. If you believe we've sold out, can you please show us where we've made some sort of huge economic benefit as a result of taking this path as opposed to taking the other path? Taking the other path would have, by everything we see, would have put us in a far better position from a power play, from an economic perspective. So if that's your claim, the evidence doesn't seem to bear it out. Upi asked a question. He goes, hello, friends. I'm a neighbor of OC, Virginia. I have heard that sometimes Nick and Tina will hang
Orange
out at
County,
Union.
OC.
Oh, Orange County, Virginia. Sorry. Will sometimes hang out at Unionville Brewery. I would love to meet you both. However, I'm not on Facebook. Do you have an alternative platform you post to? We post to this platform, a lot of other ones. And actually, I'm going to be at Unionville Brewery tonight. So I'll be there at 6:30 tonight. Yep. So if you're around Orange County, Virginia, Unionville Brewery is a great place, by the way. But yeah, so his whole point here I thought was really good. Not just by the way that he addressed it, but specifically the tactics that he used. And that's going to be a common theme, opening up the question within their own presuppositions. A lot of times we get into problems because someone will make an accusation and we immediately try to address the nature of the accusation as opposed to challenging the assumptions that somebody brought in before they made the accusation. And it's a much more effective way to get to the bottom of what someone is thinking. And Sowell pulls it off brilliantly. Let's go to the next one. You just muted it.
Solutions, there are only trade-offs. And whatever you do to deal with one of man's flaws, it creates another problem. But that you try to get the best trade-off you can get, and that's all you can hope for. I've often said there are three questions that I think would destroy most of the arguments on the left. And the first is, compared to what? The second is, at what cost? And the third is, what hard evidence do you have? Now, there are very few ideas on the left that can pass all three of those kinds of things.
All right, so compared to what? They're going to say, well, compared to my delusions and fantasies. And then at what cost? They're going to say, look, Nick, we're thinking about people, not profits.
Yeah.
And then what was his third point?
What hard evidence?
What
do you
hard
have to back up
evidence?
this?
Well, don't you know that hard evidence is just a sign of white supremacy?
Right. If you ask for hard evidence, you're just a bigot.
Like all three of those points, like the postmodernists have a refutation. Granted, it's a refutation that's like completely.
Well, it's a self-defeating refutation. And then we talked about this when we talked about postmodernism. Every single postmodernist likes to rely on facts and reason until their arguments fall apart, and then they run to postmodernism as, well, there is no objective truth. And of course you'd say that. You're a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, blah-de-blah-de-blah, right? Like, so, but there's two things that were important here. One is the first one is there are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. And I remember listening to him talk about this idea that within politics, you always hear politicians say, we're going to solve this, we're going to solve that, we're going to do this. And he goes, you're not solving things. What you're doing is you're engaging in trade-offs, because by the very nature of government, they don't, like, whenever a politician says, all we're asking, they're not asking you to do anything.
All we're demanding with the threat of violence.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't sound as good on at the debate, right? Like, oh yeah, that's a great way to put it. All we're demanding with the threat of violence or the confiscation of your property or perhaps your incarceration is that if you don't do what we say, and so that's the important part, is that he's making this distinction, because there's so many approaches to talking about policy and politics that have worked their way into the popular vernacular where it sounds nice, but it doesn't actually reflect what's going on. And I've had people get very mad at me about this before, where I've said politics doesn't deal in solutions, we deal in trade-offs. Because again, government doesn't raise its own money. It takes it. It confiscates it. And for every dollar we take, that's a dollar that the person that earned it couldn't spend on the things they valued. So the trade-off there is the government is theoretically going to provide a service that you couldn't provide for yourself, right? And hopefully they do a good job. Well, one of the things that we've kind of found out is that the government doesn't do a good job in most of the services it tries to provide. You can make an argument with things like military or law enforcement or a court system. You can make an argument that, okay, maybe these are realms where the government can play a useful role, but you still have to recognize that it is a trade-off taking place, not a solution, as if there's no give and take involved in any of this. And then one of the most important things he points out with that is that you try to get the best trade-off possible, because there's always going to be a cost. It could be an opportunity cost. It could be unintended consequences. It could be, okay, yeah, you passed this regulation in order to try to increase workplace safety, but you also made the products and services more expensive. Or you made it harder for somebody to compete because the thing that the regulations that you passed didn't actually add to more safety, but it did add to more bureaucracy. And so you should probably do an analysis of whether or not the safety you wanted to achieve was worth the cost. But like Christian said, whenever we say, well, what about the cost of this? It's like, we're not talking about dollars. We're talking about people. Well, the people working there trying to feed their family are pretty concerned about the dollars, not because they're greedy or mean, but because it turns out that it's necessary to provide for the basic goods and services to improve their life and the life of their family. But again, we get used to this political language, and he just dismantles it so easy.
Hold on. There's one question I need to ask from Ollie to Booger. I am not sure how to pronounce your handle. Says, are there any logical / valid criticisms of Thomas Sowell's arguments? No.
By the way, speaking of that, we have 2 super chats that I just want to give a shout out to. Thank you to Duck Wrangler. Didn't say anything, just sent an emoji. So hello. Thank you so much. And Holly says, besides super chats and stakes, what is the best way to support this content? I'd like to hear the must-read lists from this obviously well-read team. That's a good question.
So there's a couple of things that we're doing which we haven't publicly rolled out yet. Obviously, the 2 things you mentioned are ways that you can support the show.
We're gonna roll out some merch at some point.
We do have some merch that is coming out. We're working on a website right now. We're working in
Nick
other
wants
ways.
to start a mugs only account.
We do have some other stuff that's coming out.
Only mugs.
Yeah,
only mugs account.
Because we know that sometimes people want to be able to support the show directly instead of going through other mechanisms. So we are trying to work on that. All right, let's go. And by the way, we will have some reading lists too. In fact, if you go on our community chat on Circle, we've talked a little bit about some of the books that we all recommend there as well. But thank you very much.
In the future, we may be offering some type of membership through our community chat as well. So that would be another option in the future.
All right, let's go ahead and hit that next clip up here.
Did we answer the question, the first super chat question?
The first super chat question was just an emoji saying hi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Daffy.
The one about arguments against Thomas Sowell?
I said no.
Oh, yeah.
That's the answer.
Daffy replies and says, I'm much more famous than Duck Wrangler.
Here's what I'll say for
There's a battle of the ducks going
We
man.
are
on.
Leave it
having
to
a battle
Daffy.
of the ducks over here.
Here's what I will say. There are people that do critique Sowell's arguments. In fact, if you want to, we have some clips up here that you're going to see. There was a great show that William F. Buckley did where he would bring on someone like Thomas Sowell, and Thomas Sowell would kind of explain his position, and then he would bring on someone from the opposition, and they would have a dialogue, and we're going to actually see some clips on that. And it was fascinating to watch because, again, I think Thomas Sowell just does a masterful job of defending his position from both an empirical setting as well as a logically consistent setting. All right, go ahead. Next one.
What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away. This is even extended into the school systems, where they will give money to schools with low scores. Insofar as the school improves its education, the money is taken away, so that you are subsidizing people to fail in their own private lives and become more dependent upon the handouts.
Cut off welfare tomorrow. What will they do? What will be their immediate response? At what price to their small children and to their middle-aged children? Yes, they'll get a job. In fact, the statistics show that women, in fact, are the most successful through the employment program. But what has to supplement that typically is the provision of some kind of daycare arrangement.
Tom Sowell. It's incredible the way you start the story in the middle, as if there's a predestined amount of poverty, a predestined amount of unemployment, and that the welfare system is not itself.
So this was great because guaranteed you've gotten this question before. Like, okay, fine. For the first thing he points out is that the whole way our welfare system is structured is essentially it rewards you for not basically being productive. You could also argue that it rewards you for having children out of wedlock if you're a woman. Now, people will oftentimes get offended by that and say, you honestly think people would choose that decision? Yeah, I know some people would. It's not a question of the majority of people doing it. It's not a question of everybody doing it. But the thing is that when you set up incentive structures, people respond to incentives. And what Sowell was pointing out here that was so important was this concept of if the incentive is the less productive you are, the more money you make, then you're going to have some people that maybe don't see their prospects within the economy, as being very good, saying that, well, this is a better option for me. And Milton Friedman did the same thing where he talked about it actually over in the UK in Free to Choose, where he said, look, this person that hasn't worked for 2 years and is living off of welfare is actually making what for them seems like a very reasonable economic decision. Because if they go and work, now they've got to put in a full work week and they'll only be making maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20% more than they get on public assistance. Well, is that worth it? And so that's the first thing, is that when you set up a perverse incentive, don't be surprised when you get perverse results. And then the second part was important, was that that was the Secretary of Welfare in Pennsylvania back in, I think, the 70s. And she comes back, she goes, fine, you cut off welfare tomorrow, and what happens to their kids? What happens to their children? Yeah, sure, they'll find jobs, but they're going to need subsidies for daycare and things like that. Now, Thomas Sowell could have gone back and said, well, the overall cost-benefit analysis. No, what did he say? He goes, why are you starting the story in the middle? You're not taking any responsibility for the fact that the perverse incentives that you've created in the welfare system could possibly be contributing to the problems you're now using to justify the existence of the welfare system. And in case anyone is curious about whether or not he elaborates on this, because obviously this is a short clip, he does. And he actually talks a lot about the status of the family prior to massive welfare, to include the entitlement programs under the Great Society, which went into law in the 60s and really started to take off in the 70s. He actually talks about the status of families to include poor families and what the trends were going all the way back to 1900, right? So he didn't start the story in the late 60s, right, when all these programs began. He started the stories in 1900 and said, okay, what's the overall upward, economic mobility within the country? Has it improved? Has it gotten better? What's happening to poverty? And what he found is that the trends were all incredibly positive. They were all going in the right direction. And then you have this inclusion of a massive welfare state, and then all of a sudden it starts to flatline. And he started to ask the question, okay, well, why would this happen when the intention of the policy was the exact opposite of this? Why is this happening? And he came to various conclusions, having everything to do from perverse incentives within the way welfare is distributed to just the perverse incentives inherent in a government welfare run system. But then one of the other things too that he talked about that he's going to elaborate on a little bit more in another clip here is that organizations within the government that have a particular budget based up around a problem, right, they benefit from the problem existing. If they eradicate the problem, they eradicate their need for existing. And so that in and itself can create perverse incentives if it's not structured correctly. So yeah, if you have a government agency where the whole purpose of their existence is distributing welfare, well, they're actually going to be big advocates for why you need even more welfare. Because the way that you move up within government programs usually has to do with bigger budgets, more authorities, and more personnel. You have to justify that budget. And then all of a sudden it becomes very easy to be like, well, we just want to help people, whereas you want to take the help away. And Thomas Sowell is going, no. Before you try to guilt me on pointing out the obvious flaws within your program, you have to explain why your program fails to produce the results and, in fact, could actually be contributing to the sort of things that we don't want to see more of. You don't get to be the nice person in the conversation simply because you're the one in charge of taking from one person and giving to another. If you were doing that and we're actually achieving positive outcomes where fewer and fewer people over time actually needed the assistance, well, then maybe we could talk about that as a necessary trade-off, even though there's moral problems with stealing from one person and giving to another. But you're not even doing that. You're taking from one person, giving to another. The situation of the person that you're giving to is worse. The situation of the person you took from is worse. And your response when we say we need to question this is to look at all the people that you're stealing from and be like, why are you so greedy? Why can't you be a nice person like me, stealing from people to give to other people? So I love the fact that Thomas Sowell, again, what does he do? He opens them up within the presuppositions. Don't let them get away with starting the argument or the timeline where they want to start it. You got to start it to where you can actually get a comprehensive analysis of whether or not their idea, which sounded so good and so nice and altruistic, actually achieved the desired end state. And if it didn't, and they're still asking for more money and more power, well, then you have to start to wonder if maybe there's a different incentive structure at play here.
Babe, you are saying some amazing, amazing things, but I'm going to be Christopher Walken over here saying I need more cowbell. I need more Thomas Sowell and a little less yammering from the guy across the table.
Well, allow me to provide some more yammering.
We're not going to be able to get through all these amazing Thomas Sowell clips.
First of all, if you want some Tom Sowell, you got to just say it the way Chris would. You can't just sit there and use his name and then not do it right.
So I want to go back to
Tom Sowell's
what you were...
good guy, great man.
I want to go back to briefly what you were saying about the offense that pops up here with from this like pro welfare advocate. You said that they were working for...
That was the former secretary. It was like the secretary of welfare in Pennsylvania,
okay,
I think in the 70s.
I just want to point out that like offense is not a substitute for an argument.
Yeah.
And the reason that they're getting offended is ultimately what they're trying to signal here is you're not supposed to be saying this type of thing. And then the question that you should be asking is, well, why?
That's right. Because some of what gets said is like, you're a traitor to your race or you're a traitor to your gender. Because I ran into the whole, you're a traitor to your gender thing from me.
But again,
and I think the same thing happens with regard to race as well.
But again, offense is not a substitute for an argument. You can get offended all you want. Does that change the fact of whether or not anything that he said is true or false? No. And so then at some point you have to ask, why are you getting offended? What it's doing is ultimately it's a form of virtue signaling. It's projecting to people, this should not be allowed to be expressed. This view should not be allowed to be expressed. And then the question you should ask is why? Is it because it's factually incorrect? Did he say anything that's false?
Yeah.
No. If he didn't say anything that's false, then you really need to be asking yourself, then why are his views, why are people on the left attempting to morally shun his views if what he's saying is not false when you actually look at the data?
No, I think it's good. I want to address this comment from Brian Batts too, because Brian always comes in and provides kind of a counter perspective, and I appreciate that. He goes, where the problem with assistance come in is when someone who is injured, borderline disabled, and they want to get a new career. It is impossible for a person with a family to get services and go to school. If you are not looking for work, you don't get help. You can't look for work the way they want and go to school. Here's all I would say is I think we need to look at a couple of things here. If the only thing the welfare state was actually doing was helping somebody that got like seriously disabled, through no fault of their own, and we all know situations like that, I don't think there would be anywhere near the problem. But that's not, and in fact, this is one of the moral problems with the way that a kind of a faceless government welfare system works, is that it becomes incredibly difficult to allocate funds based off of like the genuine need or circumstances of an individual. So what do they use as a mechanism? Income. Okay, you have less, you have more. We're going to take from you, we're going to give to this person. And they don't really ask, the welfare programs that we have don't ask really good questions with respect to, okay, why does this person that we're taking from have more? Do they have more because, they ripped a bunch of people off? Or they engaged in cronyism? In that case, I don't mind you taking their money. But did they do it by providing a bunch of goods and services that made people's lives better? Well, now I do have a problem with you disincentivizing that productivity. But what about the person over here? Okay, are they getting assistance simply because they were, disabled and maybe through no fault of their own, maybe it was disease or what? Is that what they're getting it for? Or are they getting it because they made a series of really, really bad choices and now you're subsidizing those bad choices by punishing the good choices of someone else? And I think what's important to understand is that when you look at private charity actually usually does a far better job of distinguishing between the decisions that got you into the position that you're in, whereas the government has a natural incentive because they're not using their money. They're not spending their money and they're not spending it on themselves. They're essentially spending it toward a potential constituency or interest group. They have every incentive to continue to take more and then expand the people that qualify for the program because it provides for really loyal voters. Now, you can say that, well, how dare you assume the intentions of the people that are doing this? Let's take out their intentions for a second. Maybe their intentions are noble and they just don't understand the problems with what they're doing. Does that change, to Christian's point, does that change the facts of what's actually happening? I would argue that it doesn't. And again, if the goal is to get people in a position where they can become economically independent, well then providing incentive structures which prevent that or pervert that is probably not a good way to help them. And I do think it's really, really problematic when we constantly create these situations where it's like, well, the person in this situation, they cannot possibly go to school and take care of the kid. Again, my parents split up when I was 3. My mom was a nurse. She had to work really hard while raising 2 boys, like during the school year. And she still managed to do a lot of other. So people make choices. And the thing is that it is good for good decisions to be incentivized, and it is not a bad thing for bad decisions to not be incentivized. That doesn't mean you can't come in and help somebody, but when we start treating that help as if you're entitled to it by virtue, and again, we're taking away the disabled for a second, we're taking away people in circumstances beyond their control. If you're in a bad situation because of bad decisions you made, it doesn't make sense to incentivize that. It makes sense to help somebody, but it doesn't make sense to incentivize it. And again, I think that's one of the biggest problems with government assistance. Let's go on to the next one. I won't talk as much, babe. I'm sorry. More Tom.
I could listen to you all day. It's just we don't have all day. We got to listen to some Thomas Sowell.
Let's do it.
First of all, people aren't paid for merit. They're paid for productivity. You know, someone who had all kinds of handicaps to overcome, you know, might have a tremendous amount of merit just to end up as a trained carpenter.
Right.
And somebody who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, sent to the finest schools that money could buy, may have no greater merit in becoming a brain surgeon. But that's not the point. The question is whether the brain surgeon's productivity is greater than that of the carpenter. So merit is really not part of it. But the other thing is that the question is, what are you trying to end up with? Are you trying to end up with the best qualified people doing the job or not? I mean, if I have to have brain surgery, and I'm told that the guy who's going to perform the brain surgery is the world's greatest brain surgeon, but he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and had every privilege, and might have said, no, give me somebody, you know, who had to fight his way up and who had just barely made the cutoff.
This is why we love this guy so much. Well, I love this clip
because he just tears apart the assumptions, right? And this is the whole idea of merit versus capability or productivity. We did a Y-Minute on this once where we talked about how you don't get paid based off of how hard the work is. You get paid based off of how valuable the work is. And that's usually determined by supply, demand, your ability to be productive. And Thomas Sowell is not saying that if somebody that rose up from really, really difficult circumstances made it to a particular, that's not noteworthy or wonderful or something to be celebrated. But he's saying we still have to focus on, okay, what is actually the best use of scarce resources to get people the things that they want? That still has to be the standard by which we judge things. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where we're assigning value to things that doesn't have the same value in the marketplace. And that's not him being mean. That's just the reality. It's not going to, if you had to take your kid in for brain surgery and your kid died on the table, but the brain surgeon had a really great story on how they rose from nothing, you wouldn't care. You wouldn't care. And so, again, we can certainly encourage and share those stories and be thrilled. I mean, I love the story of Dr. Ben Carson because he came from absolute poverty. But the difference was at the end, he was also the foremost, most effective, what is it, like neonatal brain surgeon in the world. And so we can two things can be true at once. We can love the merit of somebody rising from those circumstances, but we still need someone to be able to produce the products and services.
I remember the left trying to make it out like he was some kind of a moron. I could not believe that.
I think this is also particularly valuable for people in high school who are either thinking about going to college or maybe has recently graduated from high school and are considering going to college. And I think that what you should take from this is, you're paid for your ability, and you really should examine the college education that you may be going to get and determine whether or not you are actually going to be competent to complete a task after those 4 years, and whether or not the money that you are investing is actually going to pay you back.
We have a whole generation of people in their 20s and 30s that I believe were absolutely lied to about the value of a college education. And it's not that a college education doesn't have value. It's that it has value insofar as you learned an economically viable skill set. And I love it when people come back out to me like, well, college isn't just about economic viability. Yeah. It's about creating a well-rounded person. Okay, well, if the only way that you can afford to pay for the well-rounded education that you got that is economically unviable is by stealing money away from the plumber that chose a viable economic skill set, that's not a good trade. It's certainly not a moral trade.
Yeah.
So, and it's not the job of our tax dollars, going into these things to make you well-rounded. Well-rounded isn't the goal.
Well, again, if you want to pay,
the goal is to be productive.
Look,
the goal is to be able to support your family.
If you want to pay,
if college wants to make you well-rounded, you're definitely being in an institution doesn't make you well-rounded. Living life makes you well-rounded.
Hear.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows how much I despise the way that our university system has been set up at this point, which is very ironic because I'm trying to get a master's. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, if you want to pay, if you want to spend 12 years at university getting a well-rounded education in a bunch of various fields, and you want to pay for that, I say more power to you. I'm glad that service is available. But more and more what I'm seeing is that no, I want other people to pay for it, and you should want to pay for it because after all, it's making me a well-rounded individual. Well, no, all it's making right now is a financial drain on other people that have to go to work.
Yeah, but you make good coffee.
So that doesn't make you noble. I'm sorry. All right, let's go to our next clip.
Political solution, then what use are political leaders? People often emphasize to me the enormous importance of
the first part of that, because it was hard to hear. He said, he was talking about the idea of political leaders and political solutions. And he was saying that, well, if you don't really require what they're talking about, well, then why do you need these political leaders? So let's go ahead and listen to the rest of it.
If there is no political solution, then what use are political leaders? People often emphasize to me the enormous importance of leadership for any ethnic group to get ahead. And my response is often, name me 3 Japanese American leaders. And no one has yet been able to do it. But so leadership itself, if you have the vision that I have, then leadership itself becomes much less important. And for a leader to say that leadership isn't important is like, a Cadillac saying it doesn't matter what car you buy.
Pause.
Certainly,
I love this.
Can you
so
name
much.
3 Japanese American leaders?
Does Ichiro count?
Do fictional characters count? Does Mario count?
Well,
actually, he's Italian, but he was made by Japanese people.
Before anybody gets the wrong idea of what I'm saying here, what Christian's saying, or what Thomas Sowell is saying, this was all idea. He started off by saying, if there are no political solutions, then what use are all these political leaders? And he actually goes on to make this point in other books that he reads where he talks about various ethnic groups within the United States, ones that focused on like family, education, and economics typically always do better than those that focus primarily on politics. And he actually uses the Irish community in New York as an example of this in early American history, where the Irish were far more organized than other ethnic groups, and yet economically they did worse. And the point that he was making is this whole idea of ethnic-based representation in politics. It's not that there's no value to that whatsoever, but he's saying that this idea that that's the key to success for a group, not just in the United States but anywhere in the world, is absurd. And the reason why I use the Japanese as an example there is because I think at that time Japanese Americans controlled more wealth per capita than any other ethnic group within the United States. And now, is that because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and our system was specifically set up to give Japanese Americans an advantage? I don't think so, right? But this is such an important distinction because, again, when you put your emphasis on politics as opposed to other forms of productivity within the marketplace, okay, let's look at this and see which one actually produces better results. And he doesn't just talk about this in the United States. The research he's done on this is pretty comprehensive. He did some really interesting studies in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, and other places where you had various groups that would set that they thought their key to success was through political power and control. And they always underperformed other groups that focused primarily, to include minority groups. And again, Japanese Americans are a minority group in the United States. Why are they doing economically? Why are they doing better than per capita than the same ethnic group that wrote the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and has contained vastly more political power?
Japanese Americans and a lot of Asian Americans in general make more money than blacks, Hispanics, and whites, for that matter. It's actually part of the reason why. It's part of the reason why the left wants to erase Asian Americans from the equation, because you can't really construct a narrative of oppressive, hierarchies and white supremacy when literally we have a minority group in this country that consistently makes more money than the supposed oppressors that, have constructed this terrible hierarchy that the left needs to tear down.
No, I agree. My Urban Garden said, I do agree with Sowell on some aspects of self-determination, but he fails to acknowledge the impact of Jim Crow on business, family, education, land ownership, and the creation of ghettos. My Urban Garden, I would say this, I have read a lot of Thomas Sowell. I would disagree with that characterization. He does not fail to acknowledge it. In fact, he talks about it specifically in a lot of the economic research and books that he's done. He just comes to very different conclusions. For instance, he doesn't deny the fact that had an adverse impact on black families living under Jim Crow. He doesn't deny that at all. What he does suggest is that a lot of the solutions that were offered in order to counteract that actually had detrimental effects instead of positive effects. In fact, Frederick Douglass made similar arguments long before Thomas Sowell was born. And so I think it's important to make a distinction for the fact that he's not disregarding it. He's saying that the solutions offered didn't actually have the net positive impact that they were promised. And that's one of the things that really frustrates him, because he grew up, he was born into the Jim Crow South. He experienced it firsthand. So I don't think it's fair to characterize him as disregarding it or not acknowledging it. This one's going to be fun. This is wage gap stuff. Next one.
As men.
No, I would not. I would not agree with that. If you're talking about women with the same number of years of experience, with the same continuous service, et cetera, then when I look at that, I don't find that disparity. I find, for example, in many cases, the women are making more, depending upon how you break the data down. The difference with women is between married women and everybody else. That's the real difference.
Well, even as to single women, the Census Bureau statistics, the most recent ones I could find, 1978, say that single men are earning $11,100 and single women are earning $9,300.
Yes, I love the word single that is used. When I did my study, I didn't use single, I used never married. You see, a woman who is single at age 40, having spent 10 or 20 years raising children, is really not quite the same as a man of age 40 who's been working continuously for 20 years.
Pause. This is another thing Sowell always does, is that people will throw out figures that they think have answered the question. Like, whoa, single women here, single women here. And he goes, oh, it's interesting they use that. He goes, I don't use single women, I use women that were never married. Because what he's trying to compare is apples to apples with respect to people in the workforce. And what you actually find is that if a woman chooses to either not have kids and continuously stay in the workforce, the pay gap essentially disappears. There was another interview a while back, I think it was in Australia, where they were asking, I think it was somebody doing labor statistics within Australia, and they said, do you have any statistics that are actually tracking wages on an hour-by-hour basis? And she said no. So they will do things, they said, well, we were looking at only full-time workers. Well, a full-time worker can be working 32 hours a week, or a full-time worker can be working over 40 hours a week. But somebody working 40 and somebody working 32 are not going to make the same amount of money. In fact, they don't have the same prospects with respect to promotion. So again, this is one of the biggest problems with the way that we look at data, and this is so frustrating, because I think a lot of conservatives get overwhelmed by this idea of like, well, this expert said this, and here's the data, and here's the stats to back it up. And again, what did Thomas Sowell do there? He didn't deny the stats that she was making up. He was saying, you're still not making an apples to apples comparison. And because you're not doing that, you're not actually coming to accurate conclusions about what's going on or what the potential problems are. And so the solutions you offer are wrong or inappropriate.
I thought it was really interesting that the census study she was pulling up was from 1978, the year I was born.
Yeah.
That was almost 45 years ago.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the numbers and how much people make, like $11,000 a year would be like median income back then. Are you kidding?
No, it's one of the reasons why I love Thomas Sowell is that he opens the questioner or the person making the statement up within their own presuppositions. Yeah. He digs in deeper. This is. I just think
it's interesting that we've been having the wage gap conversation.
Yeah.
You know, that was 45 years ago, and we're still having this conversation, and women have only continued to excel and make more and more and more money, and they're still banging this, drum and beating this dead horse, and it's not even something that is true.
You need to, and when I say you, I say this rhetorically, but like you need to stop looking at this from a standpoint of these people are identifying a problem and trying to propose solutions, and instead look at it from the standpoint of these people are trying to issue a rallying cry to form a political coalition to achieve a specific end state.
That's a good point.
That's right. They're trying to create their teams.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, Rocky Top Tom made a comment I really like. He goes, Christian Hines, the Japanese-American stats are made even more impressive by the reality that they did so with only 2 generations of Karamatsu oppression by the Democrat Roosevelt government. What he's talking to there is the internment camps. So it was U.S. policy under FDR after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to round up hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps so they could be watched because their loyalty toward the United States was being questioned. And what's amazing is I forget the unit, But there was a unit in World War II, an infantry unit in World War II, made up, I think, exclusively or almost exclusively of Japanese Americans, which had one of the highest numbers of Medal of Honor recipients. And
yeah,
so,
they were active in the European theater.
Yeah, it was absolutely a. You want to talk about violation of due process. You want to talk about the suspension of the unconstitutional suspension of civil liberties. It was bad. But again, it just goes to show that there's the degree to which you can overcome within a relatively short period of time, based off of focusing on the right things, is pretty incredible. All right, let's go to the next one.
Big confusion among the redistributionists is between opportunity and outcomes. And one of the examples I used in a recent column was that, when I was a kid, I briefly tried to play basketball. And I was lucky to hit the backboard, never mind the basket, But I had just as much opportunity to play basketball as Michael Jordan had. You cannot measure opportunity by outcomes. And that's what the redistributionists insist on doing. They say this group obviously didn't have equal opportunity because they were turned down for loans more so than that group. Yes, if you have lower credit scores, you'll be turned down for loans more so than people with high credit scores.
So this is where we get into the whole equity debate. And he was actually making this comment before equity kind of became the term du jour. Before it was equality, then it was equality of opportunity, which by the way, I'll hear conservatives talk about equality of opportunity as if, and it kind of plays right into what I believe is this progressive narrative that it's not that you didn't have any legal prohibition about you doing something. Like what he was just describing there is like, I had every opportunity to be a professional basketball player as much as Michael Jordan. The difference is I didn't have the aptitude, the ability, or the desire. Does that mean that somehow I was oppressed or somehow something was wrong? And the answer is no. And a lot of people say, well, is it fair? Let me give you an example of this. If I have two kids that want to go to college, want to go to medical school, and one was raised in a family where both their parents were doctors, and not only did they, work hard and send them to, appropriate prep schools, but they actually gave them access to not only them as skilled professionals, but other people as well. And then you had another student over here that wants to be a doctor that was raised in, like, say, a single parent home and, just did not have the same opportunities whatsoever. Do both of them have an equal opportunity to become doctors? Well, with respect to legal prohibitions, yes. There's no legal prohibitions on this person becoming a doctor versus this person becoming a doctor. But do they have the same degree of probability based off of their circumstances? No. Now, some people will look at that and be like, well, this is why we have to give this person additional support to be able to do that. I certainly have no problem with doing that if that's a personal decision you want to make. I do think it's fair to suggest that we need to be very, very careful that when we make it a policy decision, that we're going to give special advantages over here, because as much as we can look at the situation of this particular student or potential doctor and say, yeah, we want to help them out, the moment you say as a rule, as a legal policy, we're going to put this person we're going to decrease the advantages conveyed to this person in order to give this person a better chance. Well, one, you're not necessarily guaranteeing you're going to get the best doctor, which is ultimately what the marketplace demands. But the other thing that you're doing is you've just told this student, and specifically you've told their parents, that, hey, all that work you did to try to use your skills, your access and everything else to be able to put your kid in a better position than you might have had, we're now going to dock you points for that. That is a pretty bad, pretty perverse incentive structure. And for anybody that thinks that I'm going a little bit too far with this, I've seen academics argue that reading to your children conveys an unfair advantage to them over children that grew up in families where their parents did not read to them, and actually called for public policy to adjudicate that problem. Well, think about it for a second. Do you want to tell parents that, hey, the best way to get your kid into college, the way to guarantee that your kid can get into college is to get divorced and beat them? Right? It's not to work extra hard to get them additional tutors and things like that. No. Beat them. Make sure they have a really, really good story to tell when they're talking about getting into college, about how they had to overcome something. I don't think that's the sort of incentive structure we want to create within society. And again, people will say, well, that's absurd. I'm sorry. You don't get to look at the last 5 years of policy decisions. You look at the last 5 years of what's being pushed socially, culturally by academia and tell me that's absurd. So no, we want parents to be incentivized to put their children in a better position than they had, to give them advantages. That's what you want, right? There's a reason why, like, if you want to give your kid no advantages, well, shoot, why feed them? Why change their diapers? I mean, gosh, let's let them, hey, boom, we're really setting them up for success now. Every single one of us is born cold, hungry, screaming, and unable to feed ourselves. And we're relying upon our parents to be able to raise us up and set us up for success in the future. If you want to continue to encourage a society that does that, then you can't punish parents for doing the right thing. All right, let's go and look at the next one.
Number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere,
yes,
but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth because
So yeah, again, he addressing the whole reparations argument where it's, it's if history only begins when you want it to begin in order to buttress your argument, then yeah, you can come to any conclusion you want. He's saying that you actually have to move the argument back to get a more comprehensive figure, because are you going to pay is the Middle East going to pay reparations to Africa? Is the Barbary pirate states going to pay reparations to Europeans and the Slavs? Is Brazil going to pay? Like, where does this all end? Where does it all start? Where does it all end? And that's the problem of, again, and he talks about this a lot. You can prove anything you want with statistics, provided that you only choose the data that you want to analyze, or you start the clock at the moment that's most advantageous for your argument. And I think he does a good job of going back. Brian Betts asked a question here. He said, what do you say to the parents of children whose children lost a spot at a major university because a C-average student was in the child of a legacy donor got the spot? Brian Betts, I'll tell you right, I think every university that gives legacy slots should lose public funding. I don't got a problem with that. I got a real problem with the amount of money that we send to higher education. So if you want to be a private university and you want to set up standards with respect to legacy members or with respect to, athletes or whatever, if you want to prioritize certain things, okay, fine. I don't see why tax dollars should go to support that university's preference with respect to admissions. So no, I think there's real problems with the whole legacy, the arbitrariness of, well, your dad went here, so we're going to give you a leg up in coming here as well. Because really what it ends up being is like, the more you donate to the university, the more your child has a shot.
I have a better question.
Yeah.
If we say, yeah, sure, axe legacy admissions, will the left say, oh yeah, we should get rid of affirmative action?
Yeah. I think the answer is no.
Because I'm willing to bet the answer to that is no.
Now, I will
Too
say
late.
this.
We got rid of it.
I will give the Young Turks credit. Young Turks, who I agree with on just about nothing, but still seem to have like some standard with respect to intellectual consistency sometimes. They came out and said, he goes, yeah, I think it's time to get rid of affirmative action. He goes, but we should also get rid of this legacy stuff because it does create a similar, system of preferential treatment. And again, my argument would be private universities can do what private universities, typically want to do within reason, right? They can't violate certain aspects of law, clearly. But if you're a publicly funded institution, I am all about saying, yeah, you don't get to do this.
There's a really good question from Lego Spartan that I want to ask you. He says, if federal funding was completely cut or the federal government completely collapsed today, what would happen or how bad would it be? Well, I think those are two separate questions, because one is the doom cycle that I've been talking about in previous podcasts. And the other one is just simply we stop subsidizing queer studies in universities. I think there's a big difference between the federal government cutting funding for higher education and we have a sovereign debt crisis that results in the collapse of the federal government itself.
Well,
but what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this. I apologize, Lego, because again, you're one of the greatest people coming in here and participating in this conversation. I don't want to get too far afield of what we're talking about with Sowell specifically. Sure. But I mean, obviously, if we're talking about federal funding, like when you say federal government completely collapsed today, I mean, that's kind of a large question with respect of the broad implications across the board. And we tried to cover some of this 2 episodes ago when we talked about, okay, what could be the potential catalyst and conditions and tipping point for a real problem between the states and the federal government.
I'm looking at it from the university perspective, though, not the macro.
If the federal funding, well, look, here's the important thing to understand. Universities like, I think UVA in Virginia, I think has a $15 billion endowment, right? So that's just cash sitting there collecting interest that allows them to, operate and whatnot. And yet these universities are constantly coming to the state asking for more tax dollars.
Yeah, their lobbyists visit your office like, oh, we would like.
Well, look, they have a job to do, and I understand that. I don't hold that against them. They're
Nick's
advocating.
the chairman on higher ed in Virginia, and they all hate it.
I was not their first pick because I do wonder why we're subsidizing a lot of this with tax dollars. Not because I don't understand the importance of education and even higher education, but because again I question universities with a $15 billion endowment asking us to confiscate money from people that aren't attending their university in order to subsidize their operations, especially when they use that to build fantastic new buildings and climbing walls and lazy rivers and all kinds of other stuff. But all right, let's go to the next clip here.
How does the welfare state dissolve the family structure?
For one thing, it makes it unnecessary for fathers to support their offspring. And in fact, it makes it counterproductive in many cases. A very poor man who might be able to support his family realizes his family will be better off without him. But on the other hand, someone who's strictly irresponsible, either the man or the woman or both, now pays no price for being irresponsible. The taxpayers pay the price. And actually the harm done to the taxpayers, which is serious, still is not comparable to the harm done to the families, and especially the children.
To the kids.
Yeah.
This is again, he's talking about the negative incentive structure within the welfare state, and he's actually making the argument because there's a lot of conservatives will make the argument that, well, this is unfair to the taxpayers to confiscate more and more of what they've earned in order to give it to somebody else who may be in a situation because of purely bad decisions that they continue to make. And now what we're doing is we're forcing someone that made good decisions to subsidize someone making bad decisions. And that disincentivizes people from working hard at the same time that it disincentivizes other people from making better decisions. That's a morally perverse, not just an economically perverse system. He's arguing that on the whole, it's actually worse for the person trapped in that welfare state because again, you're not just incentivizing bad decisions at some level. You're incentivizing self-destructive decisions, not just for you, but for your children. And my father was in LAPD, and he remembered telling me one of the more heartbreaking things that he saw was as he was working a beat in some pretty dangerous areas of Los Angeles, and kids that he had kind of seen growing up and whatnot, and they're about to graduate, he would ask them, what are you going to do after high school? And their response would be, I'm going to go on assistance. Like that was their career plan. Now you can look at that and say, oh, well, that's lazy or that's bad or whatnot. Well, again, if that's what was modeled for them and it made sense, economically it made sense for them because they didn't see the education they received or the circumstances they were growing up in as providing them a better opportunity. Well, then at that point, this is not a moral decision for them. It's an economic decision based off of what was modeled. And Sowell is pointing out to, again, the moral hazard associated with setting up a system that encourages that. And I think it's a legitimate question. And it also rips away this argument that if you oppose any of these, government-run welfare programs, it clearly must mean that you're greedy, you're selfish, or you just don't care about other people. All right? As Sowell's pointed out before, gosh, if the trade-off was actually producing something of value, where these programs are working so well that it was actually eradicating the need for the program, then you might be able to make at least a moral argument or an economic efficiency argument that this is a better system than what would otherwise exist. But the problem that he points out, and there's another book called Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt that's really important. Hazlitt talks a lot about the seen versus the unseen. So the politician takes the money, the politician spends the money, then the politician looks at the thing they spent money on and say, without us, this wouldn't have been here. And what Hazlitt points out is, well, maybe it would have been here, maybe it wouldn't have been here. But what you're not pointing to is all the things that would have existed or all the things that people would have spent money on if they were allowed to spend it in accordance with their needs, not political wants. And if you're not taking that into consideration, if you're just pointing to the thing that the politician built with your money and saying, well, that's the only thing we have to consider, you are missing the other half of you are missing what could have happened. You're missing the opportunity costs. And you're completely disregarding that when theoretically, and Friedman points this out as well, you spend your money on you more carefully than politicians spend your money on something else. And that's an important thing to recognize when we're actually analyzing these decisions.
There is a question that I'll go ahead and ask from Catachrome. Does Thomas Sowell have someone who could be considered his successor? I haven't really seen anyone in my millennial generation who could even come close to stepping up.
So we're actually going to talk about this later in the episode, but I think this is it. We'll address it now. I think there's a couple people that have, I think, done a good job on the economics realm. Excuse me. Anthony Davies. I've learned there's a series called Learn Liberty. And I want to say it's Dr. Anthony Davies. He's in there and he talks a lot about various economic principles. And I think he does so in a way that's very effective. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of Sowell. He's not as, I would say, amusing as Sowell or funny as Sowell. But when it comes to similar academic rigor and intellectual consistency within the arguments, I think he does a really good job. Bob Murphy does a pretty good job. Again, not quite as fun. Sorry, Bob. Not quite as fun to listen to as Thomas Sowell, but very, very good. Tom Woods. Tom Woods actually has an interesting background. He's actually got a degree in Harvard in history and started studying economics. And he's one of the few historians that actually has a pretty good grasp on economics when he looks at history. Tom Woods reminds me more of the model of talking about these principles from a historical standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and the way that's really easy and funny to listen to because he's a total smart aleck. But again, I think there's only one Thomas Sowell. I think, trying to say who's the next Thomas Sowell to me almost is borderline blasphemous to me.
I think you have great thinkers and great communicators that come into every generation, and we recognize them when we see them, and every generation has them.
Yeah, I think, it was funny in conservative politics, there was a lot of talking about, who's the next Ronald Reagan? Who's the next Ronald Reagan? And I used to tell people, like, I don't think Ronald Reagan would have ever asked that question. I think he would have focused on, no, there's going to be somebody else with a different approach, but same values, same principles, and they're going to advocate for it in a way that is effective in their own way. And sometimes I think it's problematic for us to get too obsessed with I say this as someone that
you almost don't recognize these up and comers as they're up and coming.
Right.
We don't actually recognize them until they have a very long history behind them of doing these great things. And that goes back to what I was saying in the podcast I was controlling, is that you make choices that bring you closer and closer to your ideal or further and further from your ideal. And it's up to you which choices you make to get where you want to be. And I think sometimes these people over time write an amazing book, and then they write another amazing book, and then they're invited to come and speak, and then they speak, and
Thomas Sowell, you write like 30 amazing
right, but over time, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like he did this overnight. He spent a lifetime doing this.
Yes.
That's true. I will say this about Sowell, though. He was such a prolific author, and he wrote so much in a relatively short period of time that again, Walter Williams was a contemporary, obviously, that also did a good job. Again, I think Anthony Davies, Bob Murphy, Tom Woods, these are all people that I enjoy listening to. Some people would probably point out like Tom DeLorenzo and some others as well. Those guys are all Austrian school, so it's a little bit different.
I mean, I was just trying to point out that it's not like he was ordained to be Thomas Sowell, back in the day. what happened was this man put in rigorous work and became who he is because he put in the work. And he did this. And also, I do believe he also has an amazing gifting. So the amazing gifting combined with putting in the work, a lot of people have pretty amazing giftings, great communicators, great thinkers, and then they squander it through their choices. And he did not squander what was given to him. That's
actually an excellent point. I know you got something for me, but I want to hit on this real quick because we're going to lose something if we don't mention what Tina just said. It's this idea of a gift with an incredible amount of discipline and work ethic. I don't know if you've ever listened to, you could look at someone like Kobe Bryant and be like, oh, well, he was just naturally talented. And then you look at what Kobe Bryant's work regime his training regiment was. It was incredible. And one of the things that's so beautiful, this is my problem with kind of like this hyper egalitarian approach that we see within like the equity school of thought, is this idea that if everybody doesn't have the same, not just the same opportunity in the sense that there's no legal prohibition, but like the same shot at achieving, their goal in a particular field, then something's wrong with society. That's impossible to achieve. And people are like, well, does that mean we shouldn't try? Yeah, if it's impossible, you probably shouldn't try, because that gives us some insight into the nature of humanity. It would not be, let me put it this way. It would not be fair if someone had told somebody far more skilled at a professional sport that, no, you can't do that because we got to give Freitas a shot because he doesn't have the same, natural advantages or whatever else it is. That wouldn't have been fair to the person that does have those advantages. What I want is an economic system that allows me to find where the gifts that I have combined with my work ethic can allow me to maximize my productivity and contribution. That's what I want. I want to find that. And there might be some bumps in the road. You might have to struggle around a little bit to figure out where that is. But once you find it, what you'll find is that you find incredible purpose and meaning in actually carrying that out and developing it. But instead, if we're going to focus on, no, whatever the first thing that you wanted to do, whatever your passion was at that particular moment, if you don't have the same exact opportunity as everybody else, then society has some answering to do. No, it doesn't. That's called reality. So listen. If you find someone that you believe is at a competitive disadvantage but has a lot of grit and a lot of drive, and they are putting in the work and effort, and you want to come alongside and help them, excellent. That's what mentorship is about. And that person will genuinely appreciate the opportunity that they've been given because they know someone else sacrificed because they saw something in them. And so much of the encouragement associated with that transaction is so much more important than a government or a politician just saying, here's some stuff. But that's so critical, is having the opportunity, because in most places in the world, that's not how it works. In most places in the world, your future is largely determined based almost exclusively off of the conditions or circumstances that you were born into. And the United States has done such a good job of altering that narrative to where people can arise from nothing and accomplish something incredible. You're never going to get perfect equilibrium. All you can do is remove the sort of legal barriers and oppressive barriers that have existed throughout most of human history and replace it with greater freedom to pursue opportunity and find the place that best represents both your passions, your capabilities, and the work ethic that you're willing to dedicate in order to, hone those. So anyway,
I was just going to make a comment very quickly that Thomas Sowell didn't become really famous until his speaking career, his writing career, his doing interviews had slowed down. Like in the last couple of years, he doesn't do many interviews. And has he written
he's
any?
93 now.
Right, but my point is that he didn't become very well known until after he had already put in all the work.
Oh, he had written several. I forget what book he was on and what speaking before he really took off. I think Free to Choose and William F. Buckley certainly put him on the radar. But yeah, to your point, it was a lifetime of effort that has led him to this status. And it's easy to look at Thomas Sowell at 70 and be like, well, yeah, he's got all this recognition and all these advantages. It's like he came from nothing and built it up over years and didn't fully recognize the total academic and success and everything that came with it until later on in his career, which is pretty normal. All right, Cripplehead01, thank you very much. And they said, give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish and he eats for the rest of his life. Give a man a fish for the rest of his life and he loses the ability to strive for anything and becomes subservient. I think there's a ton of truth to that. And this is the moral problem. We talk sometimes about the economic problem with the welfare system. The moral problem is that if welfare becomes a road to dependency, you're not just robbing someone of a potentially better economic status had they developed and honed their skills. You're actually discouraging them to hone their skills in the first place because you've created an artificial economic advantage, which will never lead to the sort of independence they want and will actually create dependency in the long term. But at that moment, it's tempting to take because we do have a drive to try to get the most benefit for the least amount of effort. And a positive outworking for that is efficiency. A negative outworking for that is dependency because someone else is subsidizing your behavior.
It's not just tempting for the person taking it; it's tempting for the politician offering it as well.
Oh, incredible!
In fact, it's especially tempting for the intellectuals that champion this type of stuff. And when I say the word intellectual, I mean it in the sense of what Thomas Sowell means. Do we actually want to play some more of the clips from him?
Yeah. Let's
we've got a few, I think, where he goes into more detail about that.
Yeah.
Intellectuals have a great tendency to see poverty as a great moral problem to which they have the solution. Now, the human race began in poverty. So there's no mysterious explanation as to why some people are poor. The question is, why have some people gotten prosperous? And in particular, why have some gotten prosperous to a greater degree than others? But everybody started poor. So poverty is not a mystery to be solved by intellectuals. More than that, I think one of the things I wish I put more emphasis on in the book is that intellectuals have no interest in what creates wealth and what inhibits the creation of wealth. They are very concerned about the distribution of it, but they act as if wealth just exists somehow. And it's only a question, it's like manna from heaven. It's only a question of how we split it up.
And why should that be? Why shouldn't they find that question at least intellectually fascinating?
Because it would destroy the whole vision that they have.
Because it would lead to the answer of free markets.
Well,
Pause.
That's what I mean. There's an incentive not just on the side to take. There's an incentive on the side to virtue signal about look at how altruistic I am, that I'm supporting this redistribution system because I have fallen into the fixed pie fallacy.
Yeah.
The idea that wealth is a fixed, there's only it's almost like a Malthusian equivalent of economics.
Yeah.
Right? There's only a fixed amount of wealth in the world and we just need to make sure that it's redistributed equally rather than asking where does wealth come from. We've done many Y minutes on this. In fact, one of our best performing Y minutes of all time was one that I never anticipated would do well. And it was something around the lines of why is this country rich but its people are poor? And what we talked about was there's this mineral. It's not a mineral. There's this material, magnesite, that's abundant in North Korea, but it's just sitting in the ground. It's potentially worth billions upon billions, potentially even trillions of dollars, and yet in North Korea, it's just sitting there. And so on paper, North Korea has the potential to tap into a tremendous amount of wealth. So then the question is, why don't they? And what Thomas Sowell gets to in this clip and some of his other writings is that wealth is something that is created. It's not something that just exists. The magnesite just exists, but it's worthless in its current state sitting in the ground in North Korea. If North Korea wanted to make itself wealthy, it would need to incentivize people to go and dig up the magnesite and refine it and sell it on the market.
In this case, the incentivization already exists. They're legally prohibited from doing it. And this is the most important takeaway that I want everyone to understand from what he said there was there's no reason to explain poverty. Poverty is the natural state of mankind. But you see, there's this whole industry within intellectuals to why do we have in a nation with such wealth, why do we have poverty? Like, no. The poverty is not the curious part. The wealth is the curious part. We actually did a React video not that long ago where I really just took objection to this one person that said, all right, we're going to take the cumulative wealth of the United States, which is roughly, $19 trillion. And now we're going to split it up by the pop. I said, wait, you got stop. When the pilgrims or when the people that arrived in Jamestown got here, was there just trillions of dollars in wealth sitting around on the ground and now it's just a question of how we split it up? No. People actually had to create that sort of value. It took a mind, it took effort, it took cooperation, it took competition, it took all of these things. But no, we're just gonna assume all of that. And now we're just gonna have wise intellectuals decide how it should be distributed. Here's the question you got to ask a liberal or an intellectual, a progressive intellectual, whenever they're talking about wealth distribution. First, ask them how much of their own wealth they've created and how they distribute it. Before I entertain any of their ideas on how they're going to distribute what somebody else has created, I want to know what they've created and how they've distributed it. Because that's what I find so insulting about this whole process is the presumption that the people not creating wealth get to decide how it's distributed because they have a PhD. Okay, well, you distributed your money on getting a PhD. How much value did that bring to everybody else? Did you hire a lot of people? Did you create products and services that other people wanted?
No, you likely created a bunch of people that want to take money from other people's pockets.
Yeah, or are you just creating ideas, the consequences of which you pay no price for if it goes poorly? And that's in fact, Thomas Sowell has a whole book called Intellectualism and Society. It's one of the top books. If you are looking at reading something from Thomas Sowell, I loved basic economics, but obviously that's somewhat of a drier topic. Intellectuals in Society, and I would say the Thomas Sowell Reader are two ones that you would really consider as like a good introduction to Thomas Sowell. The Thomas Sowell Reader is a series of his like 1-page, 2-page articles that he wrote for newspapers. And then Intellectuals in Society is where he really unpacks this whole idea. Two other good ones are Vision of the Anointed and A Conflict of Visions, because that's where he talks about these different philosophical components. All right, Callum Dimmick said, are you able to set up one of those Amazon pages where the profits are shared with you guys? Because I would love to buy books off of a page where we can read your suggested books if some of the profits went to funding this channel.
We can do that.
All right, he said we can do that. All right, good deal. So we'll look into that. But thank you.
All right, we got to keep moving along. We've got we only have
let's go for the next one.
25 more
Nick,
minutes.
if there are any specific clips that you want us to make sure we hit, can you tell me the titles of those?
Just go ahead and start clicking.
The welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail.
I think we already, let's go to the next one because we had one similar to this earlier.
Okay.
Warming.
I think it's a classic example of the need for crusades. Now, many people are shocked by these emails. I'm not at all shocked by them.
Global warming.
I read the original UN study years ago, and I was just curious as to how they were going to deal with the question that the temperatures went up first, and then there was the increase in carbon dioxide.
Right.
Because you can't say that A causes B if B happened first. And so I read this, and I could see they were tiptoeing through the tulips in the way they phrased things and so forth. They couldn't confront that. And now we're finding out that they knew darn well they couldn't deal with all the evidence.
So it fits the pattern of a group of intellectuals, climate scientists who have a very narrow competency, suddenly proclaiming that there's a crisis, scaring the rest of us, thereby creating a demand for their services, not as climate scientists alone, but as a kind of high priestly caste that can tell us all how to live and save the entire planet, and in the meantime generate billions of dollars worth of government programs to fund their research initiatives. And so it's a racket.
Yes.
Pause. There's an interesting book where they talk about the green movement being a watermelon, green on the outside, red in the middle. And it's this whole reference to what it was is there was always a left-wing agenda associated with the modern environmental movement, which is fascinating because I had a student once ask me why there's so many climate deniers. And I said, I don't know anybody that denies the climate. Right? I don't know a single person that denies the climate. I know a lot of people that question some of the evidence of the studies that are being put forward in order to justify, especially the solutions. It almost feels like the solutions came first and then they found a problem in order to try to provide a moral cause around the solutions. And lo and behold, what do the solutions have to do with? More government power, more government regulation, more government control of the economy, less private property rights, Agenda 21 within the UN. I mean, you look at all this stuff, and Thomas Sowell makes a good point. It's, find, look for the motivation behind what's going on in the solutions, and they'll provide the studies to justify it. And one of those popular ones, that hockey stick model that got everyone to be like, oh my gosh, the whole world's going to disintegrate and Florida's going to be underwater in 12 years. That guy was so shady with respect to sharing his data that it really challenged, like in any other report or in any other study, it would have been automatically suspect that he wasn't sharing and being transparent with his data. But this reinforced the narrative that a lot of people wanted within political power, or that had political power, and that's where you see political science trumping what we might call traditional science. Go ahead and Yeah. Let me see here. No, go to the next one because I think we already did one similar to this. Go ahead and go to the next one. We did one similar. All right, go ahead and let's do this one. Just gonna have to start from the beginning and take it off of mute.
Once there we go.
Love it.
You make this vigorous attack in the Vision of the Anointed that we should no longer listen to these people. That's sort of the big. They've been wrong. They don't prove their points. Who should we listen to?
We should listen first and foremost to our own experience. You seem to act as if there must be alternative saviors. We should stop looking for saviors. I mean, the society has not existed for thousands of years because it had a succession of saviors. It's existed because it has institutions and processes through which people can realize their own goals.
No, I understand that, but you are attacking people who would like to lead us and tell us how the world works.
No, they don't want to tell us how the world works. They want to take over the decision for us. They don't tell the parents how they ought to teach sex education to their children. They put this material in the schools behind the backs of the parents with instructions not to let the parents see it.
This was a long time ago, too.
Decades ago.
Decades ago.
It's been happening forever.
I've never seen this clip before.
Yeah.
This was blind reaction to me there. That is, I mean...
But see, once again, it's like, well, you're attacking people because they want to lead us and because they want to... No. What I'm attacking is the fact that they want to impose their will and they don't want to take... What did he say? They want to take the decision-making process away from you as the individual, as the parent, and give it to them.
I love that these are old clips because it just kind of reinforces the idea that they've been at this a long time.
Yeah.
This is not something that started with the transgender movement. They started greasing the wheels for this machine a long time ago. And there's certain people that recognized it, Thomas Sowell, and called them out on it. And of course, they were saying, nobody wants to... ... I mean, it literally is the same argument they're making now. And back then, they would have probably been shocked and amazed to find out where we are right now because of the machine they set into motion.
Well, and the other thing that he points out there, and I love this, is the whole idea. It's like, well, your whole precept goes, so we shouldn't follow this group of saviors. What group of saviors should we follow? It's like, that's the whole point, right? Like, you don't need some master person controlling the economy and telling us all what to do. Allow people the freedom to operate within their own lives in order to achieve their objectives. Right? That's what you need. You don't need some, it's like they're all looking, the same intellectuals that hate fascism are all looking for a strong man. Right, and they just want to be in the cabinet. All right, next one.
What would you do to help those blacks who are still in a very low economic condition in terms of education, for example? How there are, as you said, many blacks today who are still being given totally inadequate education, cannot be expected to get very far for that reason. What would be your remedy for that?
I know. That's very easy. I would allow their parents to have a choice of where to send them to school, whether that choice is called a voucher scheme, open enrollment, tuition tax credit, any kind of scheme of that sort that would put that power in the hands of their parents. Mainly because that would mean that the schools would have to be responsive to them. As it is now, the school is a monopoly. They need not be responsive. I have relatives right here in New York whom I've had to intervene for because the schools would not even treat them decently, much less give them access to the information they wanted that they were entitled to under the law.
If you put it in the hands of the parents, and the parents are themselves uneducated and not really aware of what the various potentials are, what makes you think that they would decide more intelligently than the present system?
I think, again, history. As blacks emerged from slavery, a minute percentage could read or write, and yet in half a century, over half the black population was literate. An economic historian has called that one of the most remarkable things in history.
Her soft bigotry is like really overpowering.
Well, you see this all the time. Like the left generally controls institutions of higher education. The institutions of higher education are the one that provides the credentials for people to teach within the public school system. And so they've created this idea where they can say, we're the experts. What makes you think a bunch of uneducated parents are going to make better decisions? And again, he says, well, look at the history of this. You have parents that weren't necessarily educated themselves, but still understood the value of education. And they can look at the results with respect to what is happening for their student. If their student's going to a school which is failing to teach them how to read, failing to teach them how to properly do basic mathematics, failing to teach them how to write, failing to teach them, basic punctuation. At the same time that school is a hotbed for violence or maybe drugs or maybe inappropriate sexual activity, all those other things. I'm sorry, you don't need a PhD or a master's degree in education to recognize that that's probably not the most conducive environment for your child to learn. But they want to pretend that, well, if you don't have those degrees, how could you possibly know? I don't know because I'm not an idiot. How about that? In fact, here's a better question. You have all of those degrees and that's the system you created? Why should I trust you as the resident subject matter expert when the solutions that you have offered are absolutely failing for my child? But no, we're not supposed to ask that question. Why? Because they have a degree from the institution that they control that has fostered the sort of environment and results that we're now seeing. And we're all supposed to pretend that the little letters by their name, it is supposed to be more meaningful than results. They aren't. Parents are not fooled by it. And they're becoming less and less convinced by the so-called experts. The more experts coming up with absolutely obscene and ridiculous notions about the way society should be organized and even education.
But Nick, you're forgetting the most important letter next to their name, D.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, so frustrating. So arrogant. I got into it with another person running for House delegates because, she was telling me well, these school voucher programs don't help the poor. I'm like, oh, well, okay, good. I'll go let all the parents that are interested in a voucher program know that you've decided for them that this isn't going to help them. Well, it's not, says you. Says you. And yet, when you go to places like New York, D.C., and other states where they actually have a more robust school choice system, what do you see? You see poor parents standing in line to get into the lottery system to be able to have their child attend. And then what do you see with the results? Well, they tend to do better. But then what do? They point to various charter schools that have failed. You know what's so interesting about even that statistic? You point to a charter school that fails, what happens? The charter school shuts down. Does that ever happen with a public school?
No, they get more funding.
How many public schools actually shut down because they failed?
They don't. They get more funding.
Oh, well, ultimately they do because eventually the city will collapse and then the schools get shut down.
Oh, well, maybe when all the people move away.
There's a lot of public schools in Detroit that have been shut down because people moved out of the city.
Yeah, but that's not quite the same thing.
So my urban garden said school choice is very controversial here because it takes money away from already struggling districts, but I agree because we send our kids to private school.
How would it take money away from the struggling districts just by giving the parents the choice? We're assuming that those struggling districts would lose money. Why? Because the parents could still choose to send their kid there. So why would they lose money? Because they're inferior, because parents are given another choice. And now, people have a choice as to where they send their kids. Well, just the idea that you would have to lock kids into a failing school because you're worried that failing school won't be able to attract children is really problematic to me.
No, I think, look, one of the biggest problems that I see with the overall argument, and I think my urban garden was saying, they were describing the nature of the controversy, but the answer that I always give back, and Corey DeAngelis talks a lot about this, he goes, whenever somebody says, if you allow for school choice, that will take money away from certain schools, the question that you have to ask back is, why is that? And because what they're admitting to is that if you gave parents an option to leave that school, they would. And what you're saying the solution is, no, we should force them to stay there in the hope that maybe in the future it'll get better. Well, if you want to take that risk with your child, be my guest. Why should you get to take it with other people's children? That's the overall arrogance, and I would say the obtuseness being demonstrated by people that refuse to provide an option. Here's the other thing that I would note about most of the voucher systems, most of the dollars following students systems don't include the entire amount leaving the school and following the student to a different school. In most cases, what it does is a significant percentage of the amount goes. Well, what happens as a result? Well, now you have actually more money per pupil staying within that school district. You have smaller classrooms. Well, aren't these things that we wanted more of? Didn't we want we wanted lower teacher to student ratios?
Yeah, we talk about overcrowding in schools.
Well, we've just achieved that. So what's the problem? And these are the things where, again, they keep twisting themselves in knots, and what they eventually end up with is, well, this just isn't going to help because we say so and we're the experts. Well, I'm sorry, but I think especially over the last 4 years, somebody screaming, I'm an expert, look at my degree, is not a sufficient argument anymore for a majority of parents. It's like here's the basic thing to check. If you're going to tell me you're an expert, that should be evident in the strength of the argument you make. If you have to rely on telling me you're an expert in order to buttress your argument probably sucks, and maybe you should get your money back from whatever institution of higher education taught you to argue on appeal to authority fallacies. How about that? All right, next one.
Yeah.
But we can't do that because we all got told that taking out loans was a good idea.
Yeah.
That and using the laws of logic is definitely bigotry.
The intellectual elite, both white and black, get to the position that they do in this country that you disagree with.
I mean, how do they have the influence they have?
Well, no, but what's their from what your discussions over the years? What's their thought process that gets them there? Is it emotion or is it fact?
Emotion largely, but also a large amount of self-interest, increasingly self-interest. I think that if you went back, into the 60s, you'd find people with different views like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. But I think that both those men believed in what they said. Whereas today, you have people who are simply professional hustlers. And again, this is not peculiar to blacks or peculiar to the United States or even peculiar to racial issues. That organizations, typically, many movements are set off by idealistic people who want to promote some good for mankind or for some group. But as time goes by and as they succeed, they'll be followed by people who can use these things for their own self-interest.
Pause right there. This is important, and I know we've got a quote up here, but we're running low on time, and so I'm just going to explain, because I talked a little bit about this before on what caused Thomas Sowell to shift from being a Marxist. And in fact, let me see if we can find the clip. I'd rather him say it than me explain it. If you look in the notes, it says "I was a Marxist" was the thing right there.
Got it.
I want to get to this clip because what he just described there about an institution or an organization starting off with maybe a noble goal and a positive purpose, and then eventually over time incentive structures can change based off on the institution having its own objectives separate from the stated objectives of the organization, right? The Black Lives Matter organization was kind of a perfect representation of this. It was our stated objectives are to improve Black lives in America. And then you actually looked at what they did with a lot of the money that they received, and it was very, very questionable on whether or not they were fulfilling that goal. And that's because there was two different incentive structures there. One incentive structure was the stated goals and objectives, which some were positive, I think some were very negative. And then there was other objectives that were internal to the membership of that organization that saw a financial benefit, among other things, from that organization. But let's go ahead and look at all right, go ahead.
In the early years, you were a Marxist.
Yes.
What happened? How'd you get away from that?
I took a job in the government. I went to the University of Chicago as a Marxist. After a year of studying under Milton Friedman, I was still a Marxist. But one summer of working in the government was enough to start returning around.
Really, what happened to you there?
Well, nothing happened to me, but that I realized that the government was nowhere close to being capable of doing what people on the left wanted the government to do. And that, in fact, we'd be lucky if they didn't make things worse.
So he gives a specific example when he was working in Puerto Rico, and he had a question on whether or not some of the government benefits packages and the welfare programs and I think minimum wage and all this stuff was actually beneficial. And again, he's doing this as a Marxist, so he's predisposed to believe that the government should be doing this stuff and that it's actually going to produce positive results. But he was very intellectually rigorous. The stats and the data and the figures had to match up. And so he went forward with this idea on how he was going to determine whether or not the government assistance programs were actually providing the necessary end states. And what he found was the organization he was working for not only didn't want him to research that, but put up roadblocks to him being able to get the data. He even said, he goes, I requested that data, I think when he was like 23 or 24, he goes, I'm still waiting on it. And it's because, and he realized, he goes, they had no incentive, because if we had actually demonstrated that what we were doing was not beneficial to the people that we claimed we were helping, it represented a third of the budget of the government agency. And there was no way they were going to allow an internal report to demonstrate that the whole purpose of their agency or a third of their budget was actually producing perverse outcomes. And think about that for a second. That is what got him. It wasn't a bunch of great arguments from Milton Friedman. it was the experience of working within an organization or a government institution which taught him that, wow, this actually has its own objectives, which are completely different from the stated objectives of the organization. So again, I love Thomas Sowell. We're going to go over a couple of books and stuff like that we would like to share with you. If you really want a good understanding, like if you want to feel kind of properly equipped, I'm not saying this makes you an expert in economics, but if you want to feel really well equipped to be able to have kind of those everyday conversations about economic policies, Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell is outstanding, right? If you're not, he doesn't use a bunch of mathematical equations. In fact, this is interesting. This is actually one of the big departures from the Austrian school of economics versus the Keynesians. The Keynesians, the neo-Keynesians, all these other, more government intervention focused schools of economics are very, very big on, well, here's our mathematical equation and this is how this is going to work. And what the Austrian school and what the Chicago school to a lesser degree all state is, you're all expecting people to operate as if they're numbers on your Excel spreadsheet. As if they're letters within your complex equations. And it's not to say that the equations can't tell us something, but ultimately people operate based off of incentive structures. And understanding the individual incentives of billions of people around the globe is far more difficult to do than the econometricians believe it is. So Basic Economics is a great book for the layman to understand some of these concepts, which really fuel, I would say, an accurate understanding of how economics really works. I already mentioned before the Thomas Sowell Reader. Again, he was a syndicated columnist for a long time, and that book is essentially a breakdown of some of his best and most popular columns. It's a great, kind of what they call a bathroom reader, something you kind of pick up. You can read a couple chapters because each chapter is like 1 or 2 pages tops. And he tackles various topics. Sometimes a lot of them are economic, some of them are sociological, some of them are historical, and he does an excellent job. Intellectuals in Society is a great one as well. If you're really interested in school choice, he has a new book called Charter Schools and Their Enemies, which he did relatively recently. I think he wrote that book at 90. So it's got some great data, some great arguments to use if you're advocating on behalf of that. If you want some of his more philosophical oriented works where he's really talking about, we saw some of these clips where he talks about the vision of the anointed. Again, the vision of the anointed and a conflict of visions are really good introductions into kind of the baseline of Thomas Sowell's philosophy when he's looking at the way different ideologies approach problem solving within society. Do they focus on giving more control to government entities or centralization, or do they focus more on individuals being able to operate within the marketplace of both ideas and commerce? So those are great books as well. He's got some other ones. There was another one. What was it? I think it was Cultures and Conquest. Or Conquest and Cultures. It's one of those. Fascinating book if you're really interested in kind of history and anthropology and how different civilizations kind of developed and immigrated. It again, really, really fascinating work, and it just kind of shows the depth of both knowledge and study that Thomas Sowell engaged in. A lot of people, what they do is they fall into what I consider to be somewhat of a trap, where they get so hyper-focused on a particular discipline that they don't really understand how disciplines outside of that one affect it. And Thomas Sowell was incredibly disciplined in economics, but he also understood that there was a necessity to study sociology, history, anthropology in order to understand how these things work in conjunction with one another. And again, I just don't know too many people that have done such a good job looking at those other disciplines and not just assuming they can answer everything with a simple equation within something that they were hyper skilled at. So those are some books I would recommend. Christian, do you have any Thomas Sowell that you want to?
No, I mean, you nailed all the big ones. I will say that there's other things outside of books that he's written that are worth taking a look at as well. He's written many articles that have appeared all over the internet.
Nick's grandpa used to have the paper articles every single week, the Thomas Sowell, and he would cut it out.
Yeah.
Every week.
So take a look at those. Those are pretty easy to find. He's written a lot more than just books. There's all sorts of his writings that you can find online without even having to go out there and order a book. I will say that there's also a lot another thing that you could do if you want to just get to know him a little bit more is go on YouTube and just search for him. There's so many people that do reaction videos of saying his stuff too that's worth watching. But there's so many interviews we've only just barely scratched the surface here of the catalog of interviews that they've got of him going back like 40, 50 years. So those are my recommendations. But in terms of books, I think you already nailed most of them, Nick.
Well, I think the other thing too, and to your point, for those people who don't have a whole lot of time to read, because I know that's become more and more difficult to do. YouTube, there's a channel called Uncommon Knowledge. It's out of the Hoover Institute at Stanford. That's where Thomas Sowell has been I think he's a chair over there. They probably have the most comprehensive list of interviews that Thomas Sowell has done. They're all within about like 30 to like 60 minutes. Peter Robinson is the one that does the interviewing for all of them. He is a great interview. He was actually the speechwriter for Reagan. He wrote the Tear Down This Wall speech. I think he wrote the Boys of Point du Hoc speech. But excellent interviewer. Excellent. Asks really good questions, keeps the conversation flowing, and I mean, just really brings out the best of Thomas Sowell in an interview. That personality, the kind of the witty sarcasm and everything else. So, Uncommon Knowledge is a great place to look. There's another guy I don't really know him, but his name's Liberty Penn. And he chops up a lot of the interviews, getting to some of the more like specific points. So if you're looking for kind of shorter clips, or like 2 to 5 minutes long, Liberty Penn has done a really good job of consolidating a lot of those on his. So I would encourage that. Jim Ross said, experts lost their mythical status when I moved into a job where I suddenly became the expert. The job I held was automatically an expert, and when I moved out of the job, I was immediately no longer an expert. That it is amazing how that terminology gets utilized and sometimes misunderstood and whatnot. But listen, I hope this has been helpful. Again, we just couldn't be bigger fans of Thomas Sowell around this table. And I know he's out of all the contemporary thinkers that I look to and I appreciate, Thomas Sowell is on the top of that list. For all the reasons that we've mentioned through here. Hopefully you've seen some of what we're talking about in the clips that we demonstrated here today. But I just can't think of, in a busy world where you are looking for the most efficient way to get useful data, which is based off of empiricism, logical consistency. Thomas Sowell is an excellent resource, and I would just highly encourage you to look him out. Once again, thank you for joining us. I want to also thank Good Ranchers for sponsoring this. Again, Good Ranchers helps us make sure that we can do all this and we can do it consistently. Where we want to ask some other questions too about some other things that we can do with respect to content. If you want to engage in that conversation, you can go on our community chat with Circle. We're going to be asking some more questions on how we can improve and how we can do a better job here. But again, if you're looking for, quality, high value, meat, poultry, seafood, pork delivered to your door, Good Ranchers is an excellent company with good values and an excellent product. And with our promo code Nick, you're going to get $25 off. You're going to get free shipping. And if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, you're going to get free 2 pounds of their very, very high quality ground beef. And I'm telling you,
every single month.
Like this is what's great. You can just take this off your shopping list. I can't tell you how many times. If you're a guy, you will understand and appreciate this. And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about Good Ranchers. Because how many times, if you're a dude, and I'm sorry, ladies, but I'm going to come after you a little bit here. If you're a married dude, and you get sent to the grocery store with a list of the things you're supposed to get, and you get the things, you get all of the things. And then before you leave, you're doing your due diligence, and you text your beautiful bride. You text your very own queen of the bees. Hey, babe, is there anything else I need at the store? Nothing. And then you get through the checkout, and as you're walking out to the car, oh yeah, could you please pick up this? Well, Good Ranchers has provided a mechanism where, because it's coming to your door regularly with a subscription, you won't find yourself in as many of those situations, at least not for the high quality meat your family needs.
And you can lock in your price for 2 years.
Yeah, that's pretty good. With all the changes in price and whatnot, locking in your price for 2 years is pretty good.
Thomas Sowell helped me understand just how much prices change and why.
That's right.
Inside the grocery store.
If you want to beat inflation, if you want to take a stand against inflationary monetary policy, Good Ranchers is helping you do that. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Go ahead and use that promo code Nick, and we will see you next episode.